Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library, now celebrating our 270th anniversary. And Cicero once said, a room without books is like a body without a soul. I think he would have been very happy in our library. Throughout our history, we've had a roster of distinguished speakers. Alas, not Cicero, but we did have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who gave 6 lectures for us. Walt Whitman attended one and praised the talks lavishly. Edgar Allan Poe spoke here on poetry in America, criticizing the literary magazines as venal, ignorant, and unfit to form a judgment. Tonight, we will add 2 more distinguished authors to our roster. I'm proud to relate that one of our authors tonight, Susan Minot, met her distinguished editor, Sam Lawrence, at a Books and Company party. And we hosted her first reading of her fabulous book, Monkeys. We also go to the same small island in Maine in the summer. I'm giving extremely short introductions for our fabulous authors, so they will have more time to speak. Know that they have both received numerous awards and prizes. Susan Minot is an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, playwright, and screenwriter. She also does amazing paintings, watercolors, and collages. Her first novel, Monkeys, was published in 12 countries and won the Prix Féminin Étranger in France. She wrote the screenplay for Bernardo Bertolucci's Stealing Beauty. And her novel, Evening, was nominated for the LA Book Award and was a worldwide bestseller. It became a major motion picture in 2007. Her stories have received O. Henry Awards and inclusion in many anthologies, including the Best American Short Stories. Her 8th book, a collection of stories, Why I Don't Write, was published in 2020. I love her most recent book, Don't Be a Stranger. In addition to having wonderful characters and great writing, I enjoy reading about the erotic loves of older women. Andrea di Robilant was born in Italy and educated in the United States and Columbia University, where he specialized in international affairs. After a career in journalism, he now teaches creative writing at the American University in Rome. He's the author of many fascinating and popular books. His most recent book, This Earthly Globe, a Venetian Geographer and a Quest to Map the World, has received rave reviews everywhere, most recently in the Wall Street Journal. To moderate our discussion tonight, we are lucky to have Deborah Garrison, an editor at Minot, and she is the editor of both authors here tonight. Deb worked at the New Yorker for 15 years, ultimately becoming the senior nonfiction editor. She is now the poetry editor at Minot and a senior editor at Pantheon Books, editing both fiction and nonfiction. She is also a wonderful poet. Before I turn the evening over to our speakers, I'm hoping you will want to make a contribution to our wonderful library, which has a rich history. We were the first Library of Congress, and George Washington took a book out, and all of our founding fathers did. And our memberships only cover less than half of our expenses. We shall be even better if that is possible after our renovations are complete. We'll have more room for books and more workspaces for our members. And now let us welcome the speakers.
Thank you so much. Tell me how I'm doing on the microphone here. Well, that was a lovely introduction. And I will say I've known both of these writers for a very long time. I'll give credit in Susan's case. I have edited her poetry, though I did not edit this particular book, but read it, as I said to Susan, in a trance. And Andrea, I have worked with I think all your books that you've published in this country.
We're in the 7th book now.
Oh my gosh, boy, oh boy. So both
So
of
you
you.
didn't read this in a trance?
No, I read it here's my red pencil. I read it, but with joy, really with joy. And it is wonderful to be on a stage with people who I've followed as editor, as friend, as just sort of literary colleague, have followed everything that both of you have done for now some decades. And both of these books, in a way, speak to a writing life or editorial life, one in fiction, one in nonfiction. So before we begin talking about each of them and their differences and maybe some points of connection, I would love it if you each would just say a little bit about what your book is about and read a couple of pages just so that we can hear, just hear the sounds of your prose and get a little feeling for what we'll be delving into. So, ladies first, I guess.
Okay.
Susan, tell us about this novel, how it came to be, and read us a little bit of its
Okay,
prose.
I want to just thank Jeannette before, and thank you for having us here. And Deb for doing this, and Andrea for coming from Rome. I wanted him beside me. He's an old friend of mine. At first, it doesn't look like these books have very much in common, but we're going to find a lot that they have in common, I think. This is a story about, as Jeannette said, an older woman, but I like to take the older out of it and maybe say long-lived, because old has got sort of a bad reputation. It's like, you don't look old, as if, oh, and if you do, then that's a disaster, right? So she's a long-lived, she's 53 years old. Freudian
So
slip.
she's not old, Susan. At 53, I find her young-ish, but okay.
She's an adolescent 53, really. She's a single mother, she's a writer. She's recently, in the last year, she's been divorced a year, and she's still sort of coming out of the trauma of that. The father of her son, Nikki, is living back at the farm in Virginia, and she's sort of trudging along, feeling the weight of all this responsibility. She doesn't have a lot of money, she's got sort of friends in the city, but she's really has to look after her son all the time. And then randomly one night at a dinner party, she meets a much younger musician who has also been a year out of a traumatic situation, which was he was incarcerated for 7 years on nonviolent drug charges. And they meet, and he's got a little sparkle in his eye for her, and before she knows it, they've like tumbled into bed, and she doesn't really even know what happens, but she sort of feels kind of lighter afterwards. So, and she thinks, actually, this might be perfect. I need just a little something to make me feel better. And then she starts to, as my daughter's generation says, catch feelings for him. And it gets sort of out of control in a way. So I'm just going to read the beginning part. I was thinking of Andrea's book, which I just loved. I'll talk more about that later. But this is a little bit the kind of searching or journey that Ivy Cooper, that this character goes on, very much takes place not just in her head and in her body with this lover, but just in the rooms of New York City. So she's not traveling around the world. She has traveled a bit, so she's aware of the difference. So I'm just going to read just a couple of little sections here. Life with a child was standing at the counter with a knife and wooden plank, puncturing tomatoes, peeling carrots. It was the stove with a spoon, stacking dishes, upending cups, sweeping, sponging, folding socks, plumping pillows. You filled the laundry basket, unzipped the coat, heeled off boots. There were sounds of the dryer, the cartoon whistling, the water filling a soapy pan, burners lighting with a puff. Wrappers tearing, crinkling, rain through the open window. It was glancing up and seeing all the places one was not, and herself there, in them, tilting on a dusty hill, hauling ropes in tumbling surf, weaving through dark crowds in a moonlit square. She was not kneading bread on stone, examining a patient's bones, not guiding the lost through a mountain pass, No, she was putting napkins under forks and setting 8 plates around the table for the people coming to dinner. It was scrubbing, refolding, crumpling, hugging, pouring, wiping, heating, brushing, corking, and always the thought splitting in, is this really my life? Is this the best I can do? This next part is she's with the musician. His name is Ansel Fleming. He's 18 years younger than she is, and she sort of dares ask him, as she's starting to become a little more catching feelings for him, what he's sort of looking for, and he's very straightforward with her. He says, "I'm not interested in being with anyone." He has other girls, she finds out, and he's happy to see her. And this is sort of a new kind of geometry for her. But this is, this next page is basically maybe 5 seconds in her brain, which is a lot of this book, a lot of what's going on in her brain. And so he says that to her. And if she had believed he meant this, she would have said to herself, okay, this has been interesting. We've had a lovely moment and it has given me a real boost. She would have removed herself from his stretched out legs and away from his dense dark arms and have sat up. She would have thanked him and would have said goodbye. But she felt a new self in her, peering down into an unknown canyon. Maybe this canyon would suit this new self. She wouldn't know if she didn't try. She'd always believed in fidelity as a given in a relationship, but what had that guaranteed finally? Maybe it was time to learn different ways. People generally measured the success of a relationship by time. Endurance was valued above all. But was that the most important thing? Shouldn't the measure be how much love there was, however long that lasted? But then, how could love even be measured? Ivy had not sustained an uninterrupted partnership with a man. She had left each one, or he had. Her stories always veered off the road. Being with someone in a different, possibly undefined romantic relationship might teach her something. Maybe this was where she'd been working to arrive at all this time. She was older now. That should make her more discerning about her body's enthrallment. She'd known many men. Her first longtime boyfriend, Tommy, she met at 15, had lasted 4 years, like a mini marriage. The ones after were mostly solid and polished, like pearls on a string, one at a time. Official boyfriends, this one for 6 months, this one for 2 years, 2 months. If she had a boyfriend, there'd been a lot of boys and men around in those days when they were young, always a new one entering the door, but now the men were mostly gone into families, into longer commitments. But if you didn't keep with a commitment, you failed. That was how people put it. People rarely said that a relationship or marriage came to its conclusion, or that it ended like a good story in the right place. No, if a marriage ended, it failed. Of course, there were the varied geometries of relationships. A parent and child, for instance, had a relationship with the goal of ending. For a child, leaving the relationship was the goal. This relationship succeeded when it ended. What if people could think of love that way? Once lovers no longer had the same interlocking need for each other, then their time with each other was done and they would be encouraged to move on. But that wasn't the common wisdom. The common wisdom was that after the first spark of love, love would grow and change and become something else. All of this she considered in a matter of seconds. Most of these thoughts were not new. The part of Ivy that believed in fidelity, in one's body remaining reserved strictly for one's lover, stayed tucked back in the shadows, where it had never questioned itself, so certain an aspect of love it was. It may even have slipped behind the dividers in her mind, not needing to see what might happen next. She did not get up. She stayed.
Wonderful. So going from a very interior, very in-depth delving into a character and a life, now we traverse the centuries. And, it struck me thinking about these two books. This is fiction taking place now in a contemporary setting. And Andrea, you were taking us back to a totally different period when the world was not fully known. And Ivy, your character lives in a time when too much is known. I mean, the world is crowding in on us with, we've known it over and over with too much information in a way. So it kind of drives us to the interior to find meaning. Whereas your Ramuzio, who I hope you'll tell the audience about, was living at a time when there maybe wasn't as much need for that level of introspection that Susan's exploring, because there was so much beyond Ramuzio and his contemporaries about the world, literally physically, that they did not know.
Right.
And so the journey was more to the outer reaches and finding what the world was. So please tell us about that and introduce Ramuzio and give us some of the prose of his journey.
That's the connection between us, is this discovery and travel, within and inside, and then
Make sure you're on the mic. Can
uh,
you hear? Andrea? Oh, Andrea, you need to lean into the mic a little bit more.
okay, can
Yeah.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
So we travel in time. We travel to the Renaissance in Venice, and it's a period of discovery, exploration, and really kind of rethinking about what the world looks like. And I think what got me started on this book,
That's better.
okay. What got me started on this book was that I was looking at the early 16th century maps, and they seem to be out of sync with what had actually been discovered by Europeans. I use the word discover with great care, but I'm specifying that these were European discoveries, and there was a lag between what they knew was actually out there and the maps that they were continuing to draw. And these maps were still in the old Ptolemaic mode. In other words, they hadn't really progressed. They hadn't reconfigured the world in the face of what they had discovered out there. And so this man, Giovan Battista Ramuzio, who is largely unknown, in Italy nobody has ever heard of Ramuzio, but he's one of those fascinating figures who plays a pivotal role in history and then they kind of disappear. And it's wonderful to find them again and to bring them back to life. What Ramuzio did, his epiphany as it were, was to understand that unless someone actually was able to gather all the information that was around Europe and put it all together and provided and made it public and provided cartographers with it, we would not be able to move from a sort of medieval view of the world to the modern view of the world that we have today. In other words, the globe as we think of it, as we see it today. So what he did was he used his position in the Senate, in the Venetian Senate. He used his friends, his connivers, his spies, his diplomats to get information, to pry information out of the various European courts. The reason these maps could not come together was that information was not flowing. And this was essential. And this is what he understood, that unless he created a data bank of some sort, that we would not be able to know what the world looked like. So it's pretty basic, pretty important. And I think he had a major role in that. And so what he did was he collected these various documents, these secret reports, and then vetted them, edited them, verified everything. He was very, very thorough. And eventually he released everything into the public domain. And this is his revolutionary act.
You called it a wiki. I loved that you called it one of the great WikiLeaks of the Renaissance.
The greatest WikiLeaks of the Renaissance. That's what it was. It was a sudden release into the public domain, in a domain that was not used to receiving information. 2 million words on world geography, and that really, really changed the world. So here we are. This piece is based on a report by a Portuguese priest. His name was Alvares, and he was part of a delegation that Portugal sent to what is today Ethiopia. And the reason for this delegation was, well, Portugal was the rising naval power in Europe at the time, perhaps the greatest power at the time in those crucial 3 years. And they were looking for a man whose name is Prester John. Now, Prester John is one of those very strange, mysterious creations of the European imagination. Prester John never existed, but Europeans invented him as someone who lived out there somewhere in the Orient and would eventually, a Christian, and would eventually come and save them from the encirclement of Islam. I mean, we are in this period at the height of the struggle between Christianity and Islam. And so there was always this idea that somewhere out there, there was a Christian king who was going to come rescue Europe from the encirclement. I mean, it really is extraordinary to think that this is the way they were rationalizing things at the time. And so they went looking for this legendary Prester John for about 300 years. For 300 years.
And Ramuzio, just to clarify, this is one of the interesting things about the form of your book, because he was gathering all these stories of these different journeys.
Yeah. And
voices flow out in the book from the journeyers whose accounts he relied upon. Am I right? I mean, this is an example of a journey that he didn't take, but
right.
he carries us. In his work, he carried us.
This was
on
the
these various
Ramuzio
journeys.
method, as it were, to get his hands on these secret documents and then vet them, work on them, and then finally release them.
Translate them.
And translate them, of course. So, yes, he was a polyglot and spoke many languages. And so this is Father Alvares. They have arrived in Ethiopia because originally they thought that Prester John lived somewhere in China, right? But Marco Polo went to China, and on the way, he was also looking for Prester John, and he said, I haven't found Prester John here in China. So then it was thought that Prester John lived somewhere in India. And eventually then it was thought that Prester John lived in Ethiopia. And that's why this Portuguese delegation. Now, you mustn't think of a delegation, a sort of diplomatic delegation that we're used to today. This was a sort of very bedraggled expedition. There was a priest, an organist, a master fencer, a so-called ambassador, and they kind of made their way into uncharted territory. I mean, Ethiopia is very vast, and they didn't have a clue of where they were going. They were just looking for Prester John, and so this is based on Father Alvares, who was the only smart one on the delegation, and they finally, after years, arrive near the royal encampment, as it were. And so at last, they're going to be taken in the presence of Prester John. Now, Prester John, as I said, does not exist, right? So this makes for interesting right.
Journey.
They bivouacked for 3 days. On the 4th, they were finally summoned to court. Ambassador de Lima could not find his donkey. It had disappeared during the night. You have to think Monty Python here.
It really is.
The donkey, it had disappeared during the night, but he urged his companions to move along. He'd catch up with them soon enough. Up close, the royal camp was quite a sight. A bright red pavilion on a riser was surrounded by a sea of tents. 4 chained lions guarded the entrance. The Portuguese were led past the lions through the main portal and into a vast courtyard crowded with royal guards. Nothing much happened for a long time. Finally, an elderly priest wearing a white cloak came out. "What brings you foreigners here?" he asked. "We bring an embassy from the King of Portugal," came the reply. The priest went back in and back out 3 times. Then, say what you wish and I shall refer to the king. We bring presents for his majesty. A royal messenger appeared on horseback, dismounted and asked the Portuguese, who were struggling with a confusing protocol, to get off their donkeys to receive the king's query. What presents have you brought? Father Francisco read the list of items, and the messenger, apparently satisfied, guided them both beyond the courtyard to a great circle surrounded by a high hedge. Inside the circle there were many large tents, and beyond the tents stood the royal house, the Sagala, a long house with a thatched roof. Suddenly there was great commotion in the royal entourage. It had transpired that the Portuguese ambassador was not with the group. He is on his way, Father Francisco assured. Then you must pitch a tent and go no farther until he arrives, the messenger replied. In the evening, Ambassador de Lima trotted up on his donkey. Still, there was no royal summoning for several days. Eventually, the Portuguese were told that their tent was in the wrong place, and they would have to move it. Ambassador de Lima, a more short-tempered man than the ultra-patient Father Francisco, replied they had pitched it where they had been told to pitch it, and anyway, they no longer had a crew with them to do the job. A local crew was sent, and the tent was moved. It turned out the king wasn't in the longhouse after all, for on the last day of October, they saw a cortege come down from the hills. A message came. The king had not looked at his presents yet, but wanted to know whether the Portuguese had brought gold and silver crosses. Alas, they had not, only wooden crosses. Then, one night, after being ordered to put on their official uniforms, the Portuguese were led into the inner sanctum. The king sat hidden behind the set of curtains. Nothing happened. After a while, they were sent back to their tents. 2 days later, a new summons at midnight. Again, the king remained hidden behind curtains. But this time, he initiated a tentative dialogue through his interpreter. Who is more cowardly, he asked, the Moors or the Portuguese? We are so well armed by our faith in Jesus Christ that we are not afraid of the Moors, the ever-quick Father Francisco replied. The king said he appreciated the presents, but he would have liked to have more muskets and gunpowder. He admired the gold sword and asked for a fencing demonstration, which Jorge de Abreu, the best fencer in the delegation, was happy to provide. Next, the king asked Emmanuel de Maris, the organist, to play, and then he ordered everyone to dance. It was very late when they were sent back to their tent, but things looked promising now. Because they haven't seen him. He's still, as I read this, I'm put in the mind of Colonel Gaddafi and his way of receiving delegations in the desert. Anyway, Father Francisco was summoned alone the next time and told to come dressed as if to serve Mass. And we're nearly there. From behind the curtain, the negus asked the priest to explain what each part of the vestment symbolized. Then came a barrage of questions from the king. Why were there two Christian churches, one in Rome and one in Constantinople? How many bishops were there in the Roman Church? Where were priests allowed to marry in Portugal? Did the apostles marry? How many books did St. Paul write? How many prophets knew of the coming of Christ? The grilling went on into the night. Father Francisco answered patiently according to the views of the Roman Church. And then the king, you are true Christians, the negus declared, putting an end to the interview. You know about the Passion of Christ. On November 19th, the full delegation was led before the negus. This time the curtains were lifted, and suddenly there he was, sitting in his throne on a riser. A young man in his early 20s, with a round face, big eyes, an aquiline nose, and a sparse, silky beard. He was of average height, his complexion light brown, the color of a chestnut. He had a tall gold crown on his head and held a cross made of silver. A stole of blue taffeta covered half his face, and he wore a cloak of rich golden brocade over a silk shirt with large sleeves. The legendary Prester John was alive and well. His real name was Lebda Dengel, son of Nahod, but he preferred to be known as King David. Europeans, however, continued to call him Prester John for many years more.
Wonderful, 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 both of you. Now, Andrea, I want to ask you both about your own journeys as writers, and in your case, really in the kind of archives, in the Venetian archives. I mean, in history, because Ramusio, to me, is an interesting figure for you to follow, because he himself is very modest in a way, and as you said, he's not famous in his own right that much, but you kind of rediscovered him, and you've brought to us in this book what he gathered and what he managed to release into the world and change the world by his editing and by his scholarship and by his gathering the narratives that you, again, have now gathered here as a historian. And I just wonder if you can take us back to, how did you become yourself kind of a historian of Venice and of these characters that you find somehow in these dusty maps? You know, you brought all this to life because of some, I mean, both these books are about obsessions, let me just say that.
Well, what's he looking at 16th century
Right,
maps
he's
for?
looking at-
Looking at 16th century.
So tell,
So,
you know,
so-
just to go back, because
just to go
again,
back,
you know,
because again,
both these books
both
are
these
by
books are
writers of
by
a certain
writers of a
maturity
certain
with their own obsessions, both of you. And they're about obsessive people. So that is really a common thread. I wanted to take us back to how you became a historian of Venice, and even maybe in your own family, how did it begin for you? And then Susan, I'm gonna ask you a little bit about your beginning in a certain kind of tale telling, but Andrea, you said while we're on it.
I never set out to be a historian of Venice. I mean, that wasn't the plan. I was doing other things. But then, a series of events that you are familiar with, because
But I love, if you could, if you're willing, to share some of them with the audience.
No, I became interested in Venetian history actually through family papers that my father found in the attic of the house we had grown up. Those papers were written in a cipher, and we eventually cracked the code and deciphered those letters, and they turned out to be wonderful correspondence between two lovers, extraordinary personalities in their own right, who could not live their love story because he was from the oligarchy and she was an illegitimate child, and it was an extraordinary love story that really kind of illuminated a whole period of Venetian history. And so that's what kind of drew me in. Also, my father eventually died. It was his story because he had discovered these letters, and he really had cracked the code. In writing the first book, it was really a homage I was doing to my father. I still had no idea that I was going to be writing 7 books with Deborah Garrison. I was simply trying to give my father his due and write the book that he would have written. But the thing is that then you start working in the archives in Venice, and you just can't get enough. I mean, everything leads to something else, and you finish one book, and then you realize that during the research, my God, there were so many wonderful stories, so many threads that you need to follow, and so that's really what happens in there. Because I have to say something. These Venetian archives, I mean, the state archives. We say Venice's state archives. I mean, it's mayhem. No one has no idea what's in them. I mean, of course, those papers go back 1,000 years. I mean, who is going to catalog? There is no. Literally, they do not know what they have. Right?
So it's not like you can look online and search. I mean, when you started to, he was speaking about his first book, A Venetian Affair, about this, really, it's a Romeo and Juliet kind of story of lovers.
Yeah.
And one of them was really a major figure in the Venetian, as you said, oligarchy of that time. And so through all of that, you kind of dug into those archives and started to find
Yes, but every single discovery was totally serendipitous. I mean,
is it really piles of
you go
paper
looking
or
for
what?
something because you're looking for something, and then you find something else, and so you change tack and you go in a new direction, and so that's the way it is. But that's very particular to the Venetian archives. It's not, in that they're really unique, and you sort of you plunge into them, and you have no idea what you're going to find and but you're always going to find extraordinary stories. That's the point. And so that's what really has kept me stuck in Venice somehow. And after that first book, I never left. And I kept...
Each one led you to another.
Yeah, and every time I finish a book, I say, Deb, I think I have another one. And that's how we've gone along. And now it's 25, 30 years.
But I'm struck by, I mean...
And there's another one coming. So.
Okay, yes, there is. I'm really struck by in hearing you read even just that little snippet of something that Ramuzio himself found in his own excavations of stories and documents and all of that. I'm just struck by the amount of detail from that number of centuries ago. I mean, what was this? Remind me what century was the Ethiopian journey?
It was 1520, so 16th century.
So it's close to him in time, but nonetheless.
No, it's very close.
Yeah, some things he excavated were earlier, other periods of time.
But so this man, Francisco Alvarez, eventually writes his report for the King of Portugal.
Yes.
Ramuzio gets his hands on that secret report. So he was a real force to be reckoned with in terms of ferreting out all these
which nobody shared with one another. They were kept like state secrets, the stories of distant lands.
What there was a real intellectual mafia between humanists in Europe, and they really kind of helped each other. And that was an interesting, I wasn't aware of how much they collaborated, these humanists in France, in Spain, in Italy, and they would be constantly corresponding and sharing information. So there was like...
But even while they're all at war with each other,
well, that too.
Rome is being invaded.
There are layers of
like,
that in
wait a
here,
minute,
amazingly.
Portugal.
But one last thing, the passage I read, and I could have read many others, the detailed description is not mine, right? I mean, it was that kind of precision that one finds in these documents.
Well, and that is what I was about to say, is I'm startled reading this by the amount of intimacy with details and the conversations that you could reconstruct from the 16th century.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's really good travel writing.
it's really startling how much we can still know from those dusty, as you say, sort of messy piles of I don't know
Messy
what
piles,
that are not neatly cataloged for anyone, but
Yeah.
on every page you'll find. And then Susan, going over to you on the fictional side, in a way it's a similar journey, but it's within the self. I mean, I can't help thinking you cannot write. I mean, not to put you on the spot, but one cannot write a book like Don't Be a Stranger without having on some level, I mean, I know you won't say, oh, well, this is exactly my experience or my friend's experience, but the depth of her going into a place of really a new place in terms of her body, her sexuality, her experience as a woman in her 50s. I mean, one cannot do that without a certain journey into the self and some life experience of yours as a writer, as a woman, as a lover, as a mother. I mean, all of that has to come into the making of this book. And it's a very different kind of, rather than the dusty piles, it's a very different kind of research and discovery.
But it's just as messy and a wreck.
And you might not know what you find,
what
right?
is even there.
Yes, and so then take us back again, thinking about your origins as a writer. What made you? I mean, Andreas is so particular to actual documents that were in his family that caused him to become the writer. That you were a journalist. I mean, it wasn't that you weren't a writer, but you weren't this kind of writer, and that sort of tipped you into another place. But for you, tell us a little bit about how you began as a writer and how did you go along on a journey of really, it's very brave. To be able to write a book like this about truly passion, not just passion, but literal sex and what it does to a woman in her 50s. You obviously have been on a certain journey, but it's something in your soul. I mean, how did that begin for you? How does it connect back through other books and your first book and how you began?
You're focusing on a kind of constant, I think, which if I look back when I first started writing, I was, 12, 13. It was mostly, I went away to boarding school, and so I sort of had time to kind of write, but it was to find out what I thought. It was a way of finding out what was going on in the crazy Venetian thing of my
Of your
mind.
own, yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's not as if I'm so fascinated by myself. I'm fascinated by experience, and so a lot of the writing I sort of learned. Oh, you can, if you describe like what you're seeing or what people have done. There's this sort of extra experience of it. I mean, I can't imagine just going through the world without writing about it, because that's crucial to my experience of it, to sort of try to say something about it. It's not really trying to sum it up. It's just trying to describe it a little. And in that, and in the process of going through your life, the things that you're concerned with and the things that are sort of marvels, or the things that are painful, or time passing. It's like, oh my God, suddenly when you're 22 it's got a different thing, and when you're 32 it's different still, and it doesn't stop. I mean, we sort of talk about people who reach a level of maturity. It means that, oh, they've decided and they're living in that house, or they're married to these people, or they have this job. But my experience is it's a continual, don't be a stranger. It's like you're just, until you sort of get these flashes of, oh, that's what it feels like to be alive, or I'm going to try to describe that. It's all a strange new world, and so that's one thing that I would say is a continual, not like Andrea says, not a decision that you make. It's just, oh, this seems to continue to be a preoccupation. Like, what is it like to be alive? What does it feel like to be a person? And the epigram for this book, epigraph, is, you said that Ralph Waldo Emerson was here, which I'm very happy because he's one of my favorites. But the epigram is, a new person to me is to me a great event and hinders me from sleep. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so this is about that alchemy, how much
Person to person, really.
just can blow your mind. Yeah. Or hurt you, or deliver you, or, we really, it continues to amaze me, So I think that's another thing that, again, I can look back. I remember listening to writers talking about their work, and here's a tip: you can't talk about it until after you've done it. Like, it doesn't happen before. And I think that's something younger writers always say, well, I got to figure out what it's going to be. And I'm like, no, you're going to figure that out way after what you've done. But that continues to be a preoccupation. Yeah. And I feel like I can also look at my books and think they take place, I won't say more and more in the mind, but more and more in the perception, or the point of view of how things feel. And that division between people is, I won't say it's what causes wars, but the examination of that seems sort of important to share with someone. Like,
This is what it feels like to be this woman.
This is what it feels like to be this person.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh yeah, that's like me. No, that's not like me at all. Well, welcome to the world. We're all like that,
Well,
and you
can you
go on and on.
Can you say more about Ivy, the character? I mean, again, a woman in her 50s, she's a single mother. She's a little bit of an older mother based. I mean, her son is sort of 5th, 6th grade in the book.
Yeah.
So she's on the playground. She's sort of the older mom.
Yeah, she's a mom who, she loves her son, but she's not enraptured with motherhood. it's like, oh, finally I found the reason to be, She loves him, but she doesn't want to talk about school and what to do. She finds some sort of aspects of motherhood kind of tedious and is pretty straightforward about that. The fact that she's a writer is completely off in the distance once she becomes a mother, which of course is,
Right, is an age-old problem.
yeah, I mean, being a mother is it's more than 100% around the clock. You work overtime always, so.
Well, another thing I thought about in the contrast of these very different journeys was at one point she thinks to herself about how you won't find a kind of, she likes to check the obituaries in the paper, Ivy, the character, and
She's fascinated.
and she's fascinated about other lives, and she has this very singular, kind of in a way lonely, I would say, life as an single mother in a little apartment in New York and revolving in the little world that she revolves in. And she thinks about the obituaries, you won't find one that says, wonderful mother of 3 who was devoted to her family, and that's the obit. I mean, that whole interior life and the struggle, which is a great one, of course, of motherhood, is not something that we as a society are going to hold up as an important journey. It's one that's happening kind of on the side, perhaps, of other things that one is doing, where Ramuzio was someone who really publicly, I mean, it's a very male-female, sadly, dichotomy here, but there is something, though, about her, there is something incredibly brave, though, about her journey. I mean, can you say something about what you found? You created her, but what is really brave about her?
As you're writing about this book, took 11 years to write. So in the process, I wanted to not have it be a book that I had read. So at every turn, you're like, oh no, that's like that, or this is like that. I've got to make it, and you think of different things and braiding different concerns, right? And one of the original sort of impulses was to, if you are a single mother, and yes, that is something I've experienced, and not, being able to say, just look at him for a minute while I walk around the block, that wasn't available. And that kind of, nothing to do with her love for her child, but feeling, I'm
tethering.
I'm strangled here, and it's almost a given, like, well, a mother becomes a mother, and she puts away childish things, or she no longer has an erotic life anymore, and you just have to close these doors. And I thought, well, what if she tries to open that door a little? Like, I don't want to be a drudgery. I don't want to feel, and when she starts up with Ansel Fleming, she can turn to her son with so much more spirit and happiness and even joy in looking after him, because she's kind of got something that's nurturing her this way. But you don't usually see that in books. You don't see a mother having an erotic experience. They're kind of it's going to be sort of one or the other. And I also wanted to, and I think this is a way you explore something, we also in this culture, I think, are very frightened of pain, right? It's like, oh, you're in pain, you're upset, or you better, figure out how to stop it as soon as possible. And, Ivy, like that section I read, it's like, why when things end, is that a failure? And she sort of knows maybe what she should do with this younger man. She knows, she's not an idiot. She knows this isn't going to go anywhere, but she thinks, well, let me just see how far it can go, because in this one aspect, she's actually quite ecstatic.
Right, she's thriving in a way that's not conventional.
Sensual life, and is ecstatic, and she looks at the people in the playground with all the children. She goes, "Oh my God, I really got something going here."
Yeah. Having a secret life in a way.
Yeah, secret life that is really satisfying until she can't. And I won't say she can't sustain it, because I'm not sure any kind of intense thing like that can be sustained. That maybe is its nature, but she's going to stick with it, she sort of tries at first thinking, no, I'm not gonna do this, and then when she goes back, it's like, I think it says this in the book, it's like when you drive out of the parking lot and then you think, oh no, I'm gonna back up, those spikes have come up over but she goes back.
Well, and the experience of reading it is, I was saying to you, it's like,
She drags you in, I'm
well,
dragging you in,
it's
Deb.
a feeling of an interlude. I mean, there's certain periods in our lives that have that feeling where you enter a certain phase, and it could be any number of things, but in this case, it's an erotic obsession, and it does feel, you give it that trance-like kind of shape, that we're in this trance with her, and she even knows when she's in it that it has to end somewhere. But meanwhile, that was part of what I found brave about her, was I'm going to just be in this interlude, and I don't know when it will end, but this is
Well, I didn't want her to be hapless, because that would,
yeah.
you know, that she's overly aware of what's going on.
But then as we return to Ramuzio and his obsession and his journey, it's a kind of, I mean, talk a little bit about his lifetime journey. I mean, how long, this took him years of his life, and we can't know what his other, private, I mean, I was curious thinking about it, there are places where we get little hints of his private life. I mean, how did you find, a sort of balance there of his journey as a geographer, editor?
Yeah, but that's the difficult part when you're dealing with someone. I mean, obviously, in Susan's case, we're deeply involved in the psyche of this person, and instead with someone who has lived so long ago, it is more difficult to put the pieces together, especially in the case of Ramuzio, because he was very self-effacing. There are no portraits of him. He didn't like to be on the stage. He was not a patrician. He did not belong to the oligarchy. He was an important member of the administration, but he was not part of the nobility. So he was not part of actual government, because that was reserved for the patricians. And so he knew his place in society, and so he always stepped back and worked behind the scenes. As a result, we know very little about him. He was never personal in his letters. He was always, he worked for the state, and that was his life. Right, so very difficult to penetrate.
In terms of an inner life.
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of glimpses we occasionally get, for example, in his relationship with his son, he has this son, Paolo, at a sort of relatively old age. He's in his 40s, and he is incredibly attached to this child, and he goes out of his way to return from work and be with the child in the evenings. He is very careful to teach him and to organize the proper teachers so that he will have a good education. So in those moments you see...
Yeah, you do see glimpses of a very modern father in a way. In him.
Yeah, he's a single father.
Yeah,
she dies,
yeah, because she
right?
dies. So he does really, it's his
Another
principle.
thing,
Yeah.
common.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's true. I hadn't thought of that. But it's true. He is a single father, and he wants to be a father. And so he really takes care of this kid in a very touching way. As far as the work is concerned, this thing he does is all consuming and will lead to his death, really, because
And his son helps him with it.
and his son will eventually help him. But he works. He has a very intense full-time job in the chancery of the Ducal Palace. He is, at the end of his career, the Secretary General of the Council of Ten, which was this all-powerful body that ruled the Republic. So, he was working 24/7, and at the same time taking care of the kids, and at the same time telling us what the world looked like. So
really
there was a lot on his plate.
So this is interesting. So he has his kind of administrative day job.
Yeah.
And then what he eventually kind of publishes is this, it's the journeys and navigations. I mean, it's, tell us, it's a volume of more than one.
4 volumes.
Yes, multiple
Right,
volumes,
yeah.
but we're talking about a life works in a way almost as a freelance writer, right? Or
Yeah,
editor.
something
He's
he was
doing
doing
that
on the side.
And he doesn't
Goes out
even put
with
his name
thousands-
on it.
And he's
thousands of
doing it, and
pages.
he's doing it for the world.
For
really,
the world.
For the world, because he's not going to make any money out of this. But he sees that unless he makes all of this information public, his work will have been in vain. And he knew that he had very little time because of his age, his health, but also because Venice was going through a period in which, publishing was flourishing. Venice was the mecca of publishing in Europe. I mean, 50% of books published in Europe at the time were published in Venice, just to give you an idea. But that time was not going to last forever, and he knew it, being the man of government that he was, that there was a window of opportunity. And then the Inquisition from Rome would clamp down, and he was very much aware of that. And he realized that if he didn't make this extra effort of finishing the job before the Inquisition would arrive in Venice, it would all be in vain. And so there's this mad push to finish the job, and eventually he dies as he's putting together the last volume. But a life of great self-sacrifice, I'd say.
But is there enjoyment? I mean, you must feel.
But he was consumed by, talk about passion and obsession.
Yes.
He was obsessed with discovering what was behind that hill, behind that turn, to understand what the world looked like. But I think all those explorers it was a sort of libido of travel, of wanting to go beyond. Let's just do this extra mile and see what's there. And that really drove all this expansion of Europe in the world for many years. And they were doing it, as captains of ships and going on land and doing also horrible things, we must say. But he was doing it from his own, office in the ducal palace and keeping it all together, So, yeah.
And I felt it, you feel in him somehow through your prose, Andrea, and through the way that he collects these narratives, that there's a kind of, even with some of, there are some, colonial horrors that he comes across.
Yeah.
But you feel him wanting to kind of really be very, as a kind of journalistic, he has a purview over it, where he's really trying to be very honest about the way information was gathered,
Absolutely.
and the reliability or not of different narrators that he's encountering in the kind of colonial world of colonial expansion.
And that is so modern, and that's why it resonates so much with us today.
Yes.
You have to understand that Venice was awash with fake news, with falsehoods, and he was determined to push forward with the truth, finding the facts, verifying that. And he had, as a young boy, he used to work in the print shop of the greatest publisher of the Renaissance, a man called Minot, who was the founder of modern publishing. And Minot was an incredibly rigorous editor, and he learned from him. And so every single word that he published, that Vernuzio published, and there were 2 million words in these 3 volumes, had been vetted and verified, and so that he knew that he was also battling against all this false information that was out there. So you can see how it resonates with today. It was a battle in which he was totally engaged, and his idea of truth, of transparency, of information being distributed to society at large, and not just the privilege of princes. That was all very modern.
Very modern. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and truth-telling is another thing that just seems to me, for both of you, is such a draw, that whether it's fiction, nonfiction, to get to kind of the heart of a journey and a life. In your case, it's almost, it's interesting because it's a little bit of a mini biography of him to the extent that we can know him,
Yeah,
but also sharing, how that first map of the world came to be. And in your case, a whole interior map of a woman's life and what it can look like. And she also kind of, I don't want to give away too much about the book, but she does seem to go on a journey of trying to figure out what ways there are we can know ourselves. She talks about the different rooms. I mean, can you say a little bit about the different rooms in which she just
Yeah, I mean, again, not to give too much away, but there's a point where she realizes, okay, this isn't quite working anymore. And she, usually in a book when you get to that point, it's, she realizes we've reached the end, or, this is the end of the story at the right place, and she throws the keys in the river, or she walks down the alley at night and takes a left instead of a right, and she's decided to, and that's originally where I thought, again, I found a whole new area of the library to go into, because I thought, yeah, but what does that look like? Like,
how do you transition to a new stage of life?
How do you pull yourself out of that canyon that she went into? And again, dramatically, it's often described, you jostle with the man with the coffee in the morning or whatever, and your eyes meet, and so this guy's going to come in, or whatever, there's a replacement, or, you decide to take up tap dancing or something, right? And she gets the feel. But that didn't seem true to me. It's much more cobbled together, the way you pull yourself away from orientation, right? So because she is in the city, she uses what I call the rooms, and she goes to the brown room where she lies on the couch with the professional, and she goes to the pink room where she twists her body on the mat, and the white room, which this would be a white room where you come and listen to people talk, or the doctor who's saying what the brain in love is like, and the red rooms are the movie theaters where she learns things from watching movies. All these are, and the gray rooms, which are the classics of 12-step, all are little handholds that there isn't one answer.
Right.
Again, we think of the way to solve a problem is you just do that, and you just have to do many, many things if you're many faceted inside, which we all are,
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think I want to be sure we have time for questions from the audience, so really just thank you both for those really interesting ways into these two just wonderful, very different, and so in some ways books with some similar themes.
Well, Andrea and I are also, we've known each other a long, long time. We are in, and it started in Zoom, we're in a travel Zoom book club. Okay, so we meet once a month and we read travel books, right? Like everyone, and people were all over, didn't know everyone in the thing, but there are people in Italy, and then there's someone who was in, Greece, and
But
so
what you read is travel stories?
yeah.
Yes, but then we drift into memoir because people are saying, well, it's like a travel story,
Yeah.
or it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe we can read
Yeah.
your novels and travel stories.
So
We should definitely
please
read
don't be
yours.
shy. Is that, any questions for either author? How do we best, maybe you can.
Happy to choose, so I can get somebody a microphone.
Well, both your talks were absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. But being a historian myself, the first thing, can I talk more about Andreas without any, because yours is even more, Madame Minot's book is even more like, for me, I have to access into it. But, Andrea, I became a historian. I don't know why, but I decided I wanted to be a historian when I was 16, and I heard the teacher talk about Renaissance. And I believe you're a historian too. That's why you're doing it, even if you weren't aware of it. Because, and probably your father had historical talents, because I believe, looking back, I've been doing research for practically 40 years, although I tell everyone I started when I was 4 years old. And I marvel still at all of that I'm doing, and I'm learning things new, so as you do, equally, I should think, as your protagonist. I just wanted to ask you though, you did say at some point, oh my God, I just found my earring. Being a fashionista, I just, you know,
I,
to the archives. Thank you. Well, there you are. How many documents do you think there were there? Or I think you said 2 million, 3 million? But papers, documents.
no, 2 million words, I said.
2 million words.
2 million words, yes.
That he wrote.
That Ramuzio
That he wrote.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it was done though at the time. I mean, he's not too unoriginal. I mean, he's one. Yeah, there was a strong, as you said, public for that, in the intellectual public, and it didn't matter they were fighting. They were even investing in each other's wars, actually, at the time in Europe, let alone, discussing literature. But can I ask you one more thing, please? How was his books, Renuncius books, how were they received?
How were they?
Received. And what do you know about him subsequently? Did you
Yes.
search about him subsequently? Like
Yes, well, that's a very good question. So the books were received with immense appreciation. They became, I mean, they were very large and unwieldy and kind of expensive because they had these wonderful maps and. But they were bestsellers. They went into repeated reprints, so from that point of view, it was a publishing coup. I mean, it was a publishing success, even though from a publishing standpoint, it was a very, very risky undertaking that the publisher, Giunti, which by the way still exists today, it's a flourishing publishing house today, and it's over 500 years old. So it was a big gamble for them to invest in this, but they had very good returns on it, and the books were continuously reprinted into the next century, and his son and then his grandson were involved in the publication. So they were very well received from the public. Even better received by cartographers who had been waiting anxiously to receive this information from Ramuzio. And you can see in their correspondence, they're constantly asking each other, when will Ramuzio deliver the next volume? So there was an intense communication and great expectation because of his authority, because of his renown, the fact that if something came from Ramuzio, then we could go draw it on the map, basically. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Thank you for a wonderful conversation. I read A Venetian Affair, and I was struck by the incredible sophistication of the affair, and yet, even though these people lived completely separate lives, the very genuine and deep love that they had all for their entire lives. And so my question about Ivy, as I think about Ivy, I believe is her name, when you were writing this, were you feeling that when you were exploring her journey, were you feeling like it was a particularly American woman's journey as opposed to, say, a French woman's journey or an Italian woman's journey? I know there's a lot of time lapse in between and culture lapse, but it struck me as I was listening to the narrative in the head of Ivy that the woman in the Venetian Affair would probably never have thought that way.
Who knows? I don't know. Maybe. Ivy she's aware of very much of being a woman, and this takes place in the kind of between 2010 and 2013. So she's aware of being she's aware of the time that she's living in. Not so much the country. I don't know. I don't think she's sort of nationally relating to being an American more than a, but, it's set very much in New York City, and it's, I remember just reading something stick in your mind about how to make a character, and I remember reading something saying you cannot make a character unless you place her firmly in a world, right? So
And that milieu of the
that
motherhood
world
is
needs
a
to
very
be-
particular, I think, Susan, if you'll forgive me,
Yeah.
I think it is a very particular milieu of urban motherhood of a certain kind, with a lot of, as you say, these kind of mother types who like know everything about everything at every school and every.
Which is sort of of the moment,
It does feel like a kind of 21st century world that a kind of modern motherhood that, and she is breaking out of it in a certain way, which may be less specifically American, but the milieu that she's in, to me, does feel very, at least New
Right.
York version of American, which again is, we all
No,
know the
you
Saul
want,
Steinberg cartoon.
I definitely wanted the world that she's in to be recognizable, but I have never felt as a writer, and I see a lot of writers sort of describe their work kind of in a cultural way, like where we are today and culturally this and that. I think my interest is more psychological. What is a person? As Faulkner said, that age-old theme of the human heart in conflict with itself. That's what I'm more interested in, but again, you want to make a character, she has to sort of be in this world. She's not kind of representing a zeitgeist, I don't think, if I even have to say that. This is one particular woman, but the paradox of literature is that the more carefully you describe one person's life, the more universally you can sort of reflect on it, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Fascinating.
May I just ask about the 11 years that it took to write that book? I'm just curious about
why?
if it changed course, if it started one way and then you.
It was going to be a slender little novel, or novella, because that's sort of the most appealing form, I think, about this love affair, about the intensity of a love affair of a woman who is also being a mother. With these two things that should take up 100% of your time, and yet it's happening in her. And then, as happens when you write, as I said before, I tried to make it go places like, I've seen that explored that way or this way, to keep on finding new ways. I wrote a lot more because, for a while, I did write a lot more about Ansel Fleming and his experience because, probably for a half a year, because one of the reasons I had him be, having come out of incarceration is I do feel like, and this is more sort of political than cultural, the incarceration system in our country is just so horrendous and amazingly it's not on the top of everyone's list of concerns, but it's like there's a gulag happening in this country. It's just awful, and so that's something that I think of a lot, more than I think of immigration or economics or so I wanted that to be somehow entering into her world. And so I thought I would explore that, and there'd be this contrast between their lives and just like everything, but you can't, as someone said, play the piano and peel an onion at the same time. You have to decide what you're going to keep in. So I realized, with the help of my editor, Jordan Pavlin, it's like, no, let's just keep with the affair. And Mark Twain said writing is easy, you just cross out all the wrong words. So I was crossing out a lot of the wrong, there's much more about her marriage and how that sort of had sort of come to an end. And then it's, now we can leave a little bits. And so that was part of it, finding the rhythm. And, autobiographically, I was a single mother of a child. So that's, again, the 11 years part of it.
One more question? Or is it, do we have one?
Hands around, does somebody have a question?
If not, I will.
No.
No, I don't want to steal anyone's question, but I did want to go back to what you just said about Ivy. You don't want Ivy to be part of the zeitgeist, but I think our interest and appreciation for Ivy is very much part of the zeitgeist. Right?
I mean, I was saying, I just didn't set out to say, I'm going to try to.
No.
But Andrea, you mean as readers that we care about the interior life
Well,
of
we
this
seem to
particular
be
woman?
interested
Yeah.
and preoccupied and, in fact, fascinated by eroticism, the libido of older women. I was reading a very good review of your book, and at the end of it, it said, well, the libido of older woman is a hot topic in serious fiction, and it is. So that's
Not as old
High
as
time,
mine.
high time.
They're all much younger than Ivy, but that's okay. Older than 25, that's true. Yeah, no, I mean,
But
we're
that's something to ponder. I mean,
Yeah.
why-
well, we're living longer, aren't we? I mean, so maybe by the time you're 50, you're not dead like you would
No,
have been
but
in
it's-
Venice, Partly, I think that's part of it. I think can I make a sweeping statement that women's libidos have throughout history been clamped down and tried to be locked away because, I mean, Ivy is an example of it. Let it go and all hell breaks loose, We better keep that, under lock and key.
Well, but neither of you did, and neither did you. I mean, these are such wonderful explorations, exterior and interior, and we thank you both for such wonderful books.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you.